Hello, and welcome to an introduction to creating reports with the Nutrient Workflow Automation tool. My name is Roman Penzik. I'm a sales engineer with Nutrient. Today, I'll cover a general overview of creating and configure reports in the automation tool. Let's begin by creating our report. First, I'll navigate to the Reports menu under the Administrative section. Then I will click on Add Report and choose New Report. Here I need to fill out a few required fields. So I'm going to create a capital expenditure report. So we're going to name it that way, Sample CapEx Report. The category is what particular folder we want to insert this report into. When I click on the search screen for category, I get a list of all the different categories that are available to me on this system. You can also create new ones if you like. I'm going to choose examples. Description is an optional field that you can fill in to explain, or when you search for this report later, it will have a quick description of what this report supports. So we'll just put that in. The next column, the return rows of this, basically you have three choices here. Requests is probably the most common version of creating a report. This is going to create a report where each request that's included in this report will show a single line of data in the final display. A task type report may have multiple lines of data because it will show a record for each particular task that is assigned, whether a person has completed a task, whether a task is pending, completed, or in some particular state. Basically, the data will focus around who's assigned to a task, what tasks have been created within a request. You can also span multiple requests and look at different tasks. A custom type report is a report that's based on a ad hoc or free-form SQL query that you would provide as the author of the report, or perhaps someone in your organization would create this report for you. That can be either a plain SQL query or a stored procedure that takes parameters. We won't go any further than talking about request type reports here because we're focusing on just the basics of creating a request. So let me choose that. The process to report on option is to limit this particular report's data to a specific workflow process. And here we're going to choose the capital expenditure process that we have under finance in the Graysmith section. And we're going to use this particular workflow choice here. If we do not choose a process, then the report, when we create new columns for the report will then ask us to specify which particular workflow we'd like to extract the data. So by choosing the process at this level, we actually make the report a little bit simpler and quicker to build. Also, the choices of the report type and the process to report on, these are not changeable once I dismiss this screen. I can change the name of the report and the category it's stored in, but I can't change the other options easily, such as return rows of or process to report on. The ISQ option basically delineates whether or not this report will only show data for the current user, specifically for those requests where the current user generated the request within workflow automation or is assigned to a task within that workflow automation request. And then show options for billings charts is an advanced feature that we won't cover here today, but basically it allows you to define a report so that it can create a line or a pie or a bar chart using the data that's encapsulated in that report. So at this point, we've completed all the fields that we need to for this example. So I'm going to click the Save button. And immediately we transition to the detail section of this report. So the report has been created at this point, and we can control some of the options. We can find things like links to publishing this report or publishing a HTML button on a dashboard, or if we need to use the unique identifier of this report, which is referred to as a report SID, if we need to refer to it in an API call from either another system using the workflow API. So that's all available here, and also links to publish this report as well. So let's go ahead and now let's start creating new columns in this. So we're going to create some new sample columns here. I'll start with the request ID. So that's often a very common identifier for a request. So First, I'll create the alias, the name that I'm going to show to the user of the report for this column. And now I'm going to navigate to the request, and I'm going to choose the ID as the source field. I may make this field column user sortable. I want most recent requests to show first, so I'm going to make the default sort descending here. And since this is a numeric field, I'm going to let the report decide what type of format this field should be displayed at. It will generally determine that this is a numeric field. Next, let's go ahead and get perhaps the project name. This will be data from the initial form in the request. In this case, this will be, I believe, the CapEx form itself. Here, I'm going to assume that you are a little bit familiar with workflow automation and that you already know how to incorporate source data into a particular report column. We'll make this user sortable and allow this to display. Let's also put the name of the person who put this request in. The name field is the first and last name, concatenated together for convenience sake. And let's also add a status field. So this will be the last milestone value for the request. Let's put maybe the amount that we're requesting. And we'll get that from the capital expenditure form. We will find it here for approval. And since this is actually going to be a number and a specific currency, we can actually choose that. And our last column here will include a file attachment. So we'll call it justification. This will be the project justification, which is a file attachment on the capital expenditure form again. I believe it's supporting documentation. In this case, we'll define the format of the link as an attachment and an icon. So now we've created several fields on this report. We can actually reorder. So we can say, drag the amount field up here to be the third field, third in order. And we can immediately preview this from the report preview. So now that we've created a report, we can actually preview what our report's going to look like immediately from the report preview menu. And so now we're seeing the most recent 7 capital expenditure requests in this system. And we can see the projects, the amounts, the requesters, the status, that sort of thing. If we need to add more data, we can actually do that. Now, returning to the columns menu, I think we're done here. So now let's move on to the filters menu. The filters menu is useful because it allows us to create either administrator applied or user controlled filters that will filter the data here. So actually, let's add a column to the columns, a column that I did not add previously. So we're going to add facility. We'll add this from the form because it makes a very convenient filter, because the facility in this case corresponds to the 4 points of the compass. So north, south, east, and west. We'll save this. We'll add this maybe under the project name. And now that we've done it, we'll now add it to the filters. So in this case, we'll recreate the filter just as we did before, from data, from the CapEx form, the facility. Here for the filter, we get to choose what is the particular operator. So what sort of a comparison will the system do between the data that the user provides, if it's an interactive filter, or what static filter do we want to put in? So we'll just say something like, perhaps we want to do a complete word. So we could say, if we want to match on the complete value, we'll say is or is not. If we want to do a partial word search, we could say contains or does not contain. Or if we want to look at the beginning of the word, we could say starts with or doesn't start with. So let's actually try start with. We could say north, which could be our static value. That'll be our default value. And the last field here on this particular filter dialog is expose filter label. This controls whether or not the user is going to be able to use this filter interactively when they run the report. If I create a filter label here, this will become an interactive filter that the user can override with their own values. If I do not provide a filter label, then the user will only ever see values from the North facility. They will not know that they can change this. You can also parameterize this filter to where we could pull in a value to say what particular facility the user is registered as belonging to in their user record. So maybe if they work from the North facility, then we only show them values for the North facility, South facility, and so on. So we'll add this as a label, save this filter. It will appear here on the filters. Now, when I return to the report preview, I will actually get this default filter. So I have the chance to either filter this report to see only requests from the North. In that case, there's only one request that applies here, or I can clear this filter, make it optional, and go back to my original list of all the particular values that are available here. On this screen, you'll notice that there's also a refresh the report. So if you've changed data on the report and wish to see how this changes, you can do that. To view the query, you can see the underlying SQL that the system has created. This sometimes can be useful in certain advanced situations where you want to see how the data was stored in the workflow system. The funnel button will take you back to the filter. So if I want to apply a different filter, like instead of North, I only want to see records from the South, I can immediately apply that and see those two records. And then the last button on the right is to export this data. So if I choose to export this data as it's currently shown in the form of a comma delimited file, I can immediately get that file downloaded to my local computer and have that as a record of how this report was running. Now let's visit the last menu here, the limits menu. So this is, again, an administrative menu that users will not see. We can set the default value for what the reporting window would be for this particular report. It's very common to set it to say, let's this report track the last 90 days worth of data. We can also set it by default to a date range so that we can control the specific date range and move it over time. We can also set it so that the user can in fact control their own data. So if I set this option and then return to the preview menu, you'll see that now there's a new option here. In addition to the facility filter, I can now look at different data ranges, and these two filters can be applied together to run concurrently. Returning to the limits menu, we can also talk about only report data attached to the current user. This is very close to the queue filter that we used earlier, but this can be controlled during the user. There's more explanation of all these specific values within the Nutrient Workflow Automation help site, but we'll just talk about these very quickly. So here we can also control which particular publication status of the underlying workflow, which particular publication status will we show data for. Typically, you'd only run for production, but you may choose to use any of the other particular values if you need to. You can also control which particular version of the workflow that you want to report data for. There can be circumstances where you might want to filter and only look at the data for a version, say 3 and above or something like that. You can also suppress the display of links to requests, and you can also bring in data from child requests should there be a relationship with another related workflow in the workflow that you're reporting on. And then you can also control what the number of records or data points to display. 20 is a good size screen for the standard display screen, so if you update it that way. So let's go ahead and save, go to preview, click through the filters, and now we are viewing 20 records at a time. If we clear the filters and return, now we have, at this point, 11 records that we're showing, and we see them all on screen. We can basically drill down to any one of the requests by clicking on the open request link. We can also, let me actually return. That's going to pull up our request. There we go. Now we land on the request detail by default, not on any particular open task. And then if I return to the preview, We also can view the documents in line using the document viewer that comes with the workflow automation tool. We can also download these documents directly to our local workstation and open them up and also have a record similar to the way that we exported the data. So here we're getting a subset of the data, whereas when we did an export of the report, we would get the actual values in the data columns, but not necessarily the attachments. So this has been a quick introduction to the Nutrient Workflow Automation Reporting Engine and how it can be used by administrators or even end users to create standard or custom reports based on the data that you're already capturing in the workflows that you build. Hopefully this has been informative and useful, and we look forward to hearing from you again. Thank you.